Excellent. So, welcome to the Matrix. Sorry, the lights up here are terrible. Welcome to the Matrix. Now, don't be alarmed. You have been in the Matrix all day. The lights aren't that bad. You've been in the Matrix all day. Now, the Matrix is everywhere. It surrounds us. It is completely artificial. It envelops us. It enables our businesses and our lifestyles. Indeed, it is the construct within which society functions. I am, of course, talking about what most of you would know better as the built environment. Now, tonight we're going to have a journey into the matrix, specifically into office building quality and the PCA's matrix. As Ashak has already shared with us, we have a distinguished panel. And yeah, just for a bit of fun, to be welcomed to the matrix by myself and my colleagues. So, Australia's unique system for grading office buildings. In terms of our agenda, and I will speak to you for the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to firstly introduce our panel, then we'll talk about PCA, or the Property Council of Australia, that question of what is the matrix? Then we'll go through the guide and talk about a few of the bigger issues around sustainability, quality of life, and really what it all means for the future. Okay, so let's meet the panel. Firstly, we have Charlie Thomas, who is the National Policy Manager at Property Council of Australia. Charlie is responsible for policy development and advocacy for the entire property industry. That includes, of course, owners, tenants, occupiers. All of you. Next, we have Beck Dawson, General Manager of Corporate Sustainability from Investor. Beck is responsible for the strategic sustainability innovations and performance and fund management and commercial office business units for the Investor Office Fund. She also chairs PCA's New South Wales Sustainability Committee and the Sydney Better Building Partnerships Tenant and Communities Working Group. Next, we have Tom Pullinan, Executive Director, Tenant Advisory Group at Cushman Wakefield. Tom has over 28 years of commercial experience and is one of the few who have represented landlords as well as tenants at the very highest levels. His experience covers 3 continents, being namely Canada, the USA and Australia, and notably his clients include the Commonwealth Bank, HSBC, Synactetics, Sanifo and the NBN. Ashak Nathwani. Ashak Nathwani is currently with the University of Sydney. He joined the university in 2012 and lectures in mechanical services, sustainability and facilities management. Prior to joining the university, Ashak was a director with Norman Disney & Young for over 33 years. He was recently appointed to the World Green Building Council's Technical Committee, addressing health, wellbeing and productivity. He also chairs Consult Australia's Sustainability Roundtable and, of course, is probably one of our best known panellists to you here present. And last but not least, John Goddard, Director of J. Goddard and Company. John is a chartered building surveyor and sustainability consultant. He's been based in Sydney since the early 1980s and specialises in managing complex building refurbishment, upgrades, alterations and repair works. John is a a founding member and chair of the RICS's Sustainability Group and has been so since 2005. Please make welcome our panel. So, who is the PCA? Obviously, PCA is one of our industry's most powerful advocacy groups. They are across all the stakeholders, notably the investors, the property owners and the developers. Ultimately, it represents its members and works with other industry bodies and provides us with a better informed and professional marketplace. Indeed, as I travel the world, I find it hard to explain Property Council of Australia. I tend to describe it as, well, it's like Boma on steroids. There's nothing quite like it elsewhere. But you've really come to find out what is the matrix. Okay, we have a different way of doing things in Australia and have done since certainly the 90s, when it was predominantly a one-page document at the back of the magazine. But of course, we had to bring quality into the 21st century. So in 2006, we published the first A Guide to Office Building Quality. It is a voluntary guide, but it provides us with a basis for quality benchmarking across multiple markets. So let's see where this rabbit follows us, or leads us. So, in keeping with our theming, welcome to the real world, a world of voluntary market-based classifying of buildings, characteristics, performance criteria that all empower stakeholders in a world of quality. I said that the first guide was published in 2006, what we know as the red one. Now, we'd taken it from a one-page, let's say, open to interpretation guide, and we found that from a structure point of view, we needed to create actually two guides, one for existing and one for the new. Obviously, existing represents what is good practice and market expectations. The new component of the assessment, or the new design side of it, is more about where you get to invoke that innovation that we all expect of our industry. So we ended up with 36 pages. The industry was horrified, but very accepting of it. It was a world first and remains so. Time has passed, things move on. Quality, perceptions change. So we reconvened the committee. It does take enormous work to create a guide, even being a voluntary guide, and even being one that is only focused on one sector of our market, because things had moved on. If you compare the two guides, you find that things like sustainability, well, if you were to compare the first guide to the one-pager, things like sustainability, security, access were not even mentioned. As we move from the red one to now the blue one, we find that we've become more robust around performance criteria, particularly recognising the sustainability and the facilities management aspects and how they impact on perceptions of quality. But quality is not static, so this guide is constantly under review. I said that there was a lot of consultation. I think from memory we actually had 400 submissions to go through and webinars explaining the process. And PCA is to be congratulated for continuing this journey with us. So, quoting our committee as it stood in 2012, this is sort of like the bottom line of quality. There is a recognition that the ultimate measure of office quality is a willingness to pay, particularly in the office sector. And when it comes to understanding quality, this is not a simple tick the box. We said it's a voluntary guide, and indeed it recognises the sophistication of the market that we're in, and indeed the differentiation of uses. It's not one size fits all, because if we made a simple tick the box, they'd all look the same. That would not be in our interests as an industry or society. So this concept of it is anticipated that a building of whatever grade we assign it will overwhelmingly meet the stated criteria. Now what does that mean? It means that it really is a voluntary guide. Even the name of it, a guide to office building quality. It's not the guide, although of course it is the only one. We do rely on our designers and constructors and managers to maintain and manage our built environment. So this idea of being able to differentiate on quality. Within the PCA system, there are 5 grades. I've listed them out there for you, and you can see how they graduate down. There are those who would challenge the entire concept of trying to quantify quality at any level. And of course, at that point, I always ask for audience participation, and I say, who shops? Come on, let's be honest, we all shop. Every time, if you're shoppers, you are differentiating on quality all the time. That is the space you live in. Interestingly, I've had the opportunity to look at other quality grading systems, and the USA, fabulous, you know, God bless America. They have only 3 classes, A, B and C, and there's the entirety of the definition of a Class A office. If you happen to go onto Wikipedia, want a little more information, it actually says of this system that it lacks specifics and allows for considerable room for fudging. How's that for a technical term? But I thought that gives you the global context. So within the Property Council's guide, there are 14 reporting areas, 14 sections whereby you can assess quality. And these are applied equally, albeit differently, to new and existing offices. Across those 14 sections, there are about 60 criteria that you're looking at. This is an old article. Sir Stuart Upton said of the first guide, don't worry, I know you can't read it, so I'll highlight a few of the sections there. This was from the British Council of Officers commending what the Property Council of Australia had done, and fundamentally understanding that this is essential for a benchmarking process. Yes, it gets it back down to apples for apples, because everybody is judged on the same set of criteria. Now I'd just like to take you through a few sample pages from the guide. Given that I've been rabbiting on about this fabulous world-class innovation, this is what it looks like. I can tell from the colour scheme that this comes from the new building section. Apart from the fact it's also titled that. And you see how on the new we deal with premium, grade A and grade B. We roll through those 14 being the overall descriptors through environmental, things like the configuration, the mechanical, and then we can switch to existing buildings. Existing buildings are dealt with under the same headings in the same way, but in recognition of the diversity and depth of the market, we address all 5 grades. Now, one of the important features of the brief that we originally had in 2005 from the Property Council of Australia was to effectively create this differentiation between the grades, but also from a new building point of view to validate grade B, because there was a feeling in the market that, well, no one ever asks, and obviously there are Grade B buildings being constructed, but you don't get a specification as such for Grade B, and you still don't. But this guide documents it in such a way that you could. Then, of course, beyond those two sections dealing with the criteria, we then have to explain what we mean. So our vocabulary is explained. And of course, as I said, the vocabulary and the coding of these items is consistent across both new and existing. Given that I normally work with lesser resolutions, I just happened to pull out one. This is actually one of the new criteria that we put in. And when you think about it, the life cycling and maintenance planning of our built environment should be a criteria for quality. It wasn't in the first guide, it is there now. And it's not onerous across on a new building. We're only requiring of a premium building, they have a 15 or year more plan. 10 years, 5 years. This is not unreasonable. So I said I would get to the hot topics, sustainability or quality of life. I personally and professionally really believe in this stuff, and I think it is important. And I think that ultimately we are dealers in the quality of life, or certainly creating the construct, as I said at the outset, of how society works and how we relate to each other. You can take any space. I said, welcome to the matrix. Any space that you're in, look at this one. Our lighting is controlled, our air, humidity, even the angles. Not a natural thing in the room. Lucky I brought a leaf. The strategic impact of being able to quantify quality, to differentiate one building from another, provides for a basis for not only enhancing values, but also mitigating risks. Now, this step process that I share with you is just that. You go through comparing, ultimately, user satisfaction across time, and you work through what your current practices are, identify. Most people jump straight to best practices. Let's try for good practice first. Then you ultimately get the performance benchmarking. The market often has these things, if not back the front, certainly they try. It's with undue haste. Ultimately, compliance. Not just compliance with this guide or compliance with regulatory frameworks. I think we should go beyond compliance, because after all, if we think in terms of the definition of compliance, it means meeting the standard or meeting the minimum. Ladies and gentlemen, we're responsible for designing and managing the built environment, and we're going to aspire to mediocrity. We can do better than compliance. That's my view of the strategic impact of quality and the need for benchmarking. So, just before handing over to our panelists to roll through their various areas of expertise and focus, because even though they're all well-rounded, we've assigned them roles this evening so that you get a 5-minute blast from each of them on their perspective. But this is my, hey, we can do more. This is more than just a technical pursuit. We can be asking questions like, and all of these statements could be turned into questions in terms of, what about quality benchmarking? Is it important? Sustainability, is that enough? Does that actually equal best practice or good practice? My challenge of going beyond compliance, the idea of repositioning existing assets to be more efficient, innovative, productive and sustainable. Seriously, knocking down the old stuff to build a nice green, efficient design is not necessarily sustainable. Did we sort of skip that chapter on embodied energy? And then, of course, the hot topic of workplace strategies. We are, after all, creating the containers within which we work, live and play. And so with that, I will hand to our first technical expert, Charlie Thomas. He's going to give us 5 minutes from the industry standpoint.
Once I figure out how to work them on. There we go. Thanks for that, Stephen. So Stephen's given you a brief introduction into who the Property Council of Australia is, but I might just recap that. So we're the industry body for anyone who owns, manages, invests in, services our built environment. So we operate across all that, or represent all asset classes. So that's not just offices we're talking about here today, but industrial, residential, retirement living, and shopping centres. So we have about 2,000 members on our books currently, and that's within those member companies there are 55,000 active professionals who attend our events and participate in our committees. Our job is essentially to not only advocate on behalf of the industry, so developing policy positions and advocating those to government and other industry bodies, but also informing the industry. So that's, I guess, the role in which we've developed the Guide to Office Building Quality. It's one of a number of these sorts of guides that we prepare for the industry. So we also do, which some of you would be familiar with, the method of measurement for how you measure net lettable area and gross lettable area. We also do, on the financial side of things, Australian funds from operations, so reporting guidelines for how REITs should be reporting their funding. We do best practice guides on indoor environment quality, and we're also at the moment currently doing a benchmarking process for industrial property, so that'll end up being something very similar to the guide we're talking about here. I guess the overarching mission of the Property Council, since it was established and crawled out of the primordial soup of the Building Owners and Managers Association, has been to create an investment asset class for property. So much like what has existed in places like the United States and United Kingdom and other developed economies for quite some time, the property industry in Australia up until recent decades was really about owner-builders and people owning the spaces they inhabit. It wasn't an investment asset class in itself. So the Property Council has tried to reform that into something, the industry that we see today essentially, and there's a lot more to come, I'm sure. But that means things like establishing real estate investment trusts as an ownership vehicle within Australia, and then coming up with tools like this so that it enables facilitation of investment into the property market and particularly into office. So I guess the rationale for coming up with the Guide to Office Building Quality was twofold. One was from a tenant's perspective, so to inform the market on if you're looking to lease or potentially purchase an office asset, you need to understand, comparing apples for apples, like Stephen said, what the quality of that building is. And a lot of that stuff can be latent, so it's not necessarily immediately apparent, and particularly before we had widespread adoption of environmental rating tools, so it's not necessarily apparent what the energy consumption is of the building, what the water consumption is, those sorts of things. So there's the tenant's perspective, but then there's also the investor's perspective. So, and I'm sure Beck will talk more about this, but where we have large institutional investors, so where you have a Canadian pension fund wanting to allocate $10 billion into Australian office assets, they'll come to the table with an investment strategy, and they'll say that we want a particular style of asset in particular locations in a particular grade. And that'll be based on data, a lot of which the Property Council collects, which will talk about and help them forecast what the vacancy is going to be for that type of asset, how the market is likely to play out over the coming years and decades. So, like Stephen said, this is a really unique tool for the Australian market. The comparisons overseas are far below what we've managed to come up with here, and that's been very much a process of consensus. And I think Tom was going to talk a bit more about how that's evolved from the initial versions of the guide. So we did have, I guess, attempts at benchmarking office property previously, but it's certainly become to a level of sophistication that has far exceeded anything that we had previously and anything that exists overseas. I guess what we've tried to do with the guide is to codify what we mean by quality, and by we I mean us as a society and anyone who's using office spaces, so not just us as building owners and managers. And I guess anyone who walks into an office building is going to have an impression of that, and they're not going to necessarily know what it is that makes them have that reaction. So things like the quality of the finishings, the air quality, the temperature, the whether or not the lift vibrates, or what the accessibility is when you're entering the building for all types of abled people. So we've tried. It's quite a significant effort to take all of those criteria and condense them down into what was a 39-page guide, and now much less. So just before I hand over to Beck, I'll mention that, like Stephen said, it is an ongoing process keeping the guide up to date, because perceptions of quality do constantly move. So next year will be the next review of the guide, and we'll be rolling out Stephen and dusting him off and putting him back in charge of that committee if he'll let us. So there'll be a new participation process where we will be out consulting on that from early next year.
Thank you, Charlie. And so taking on from there, I think the first thing I was going to say is, Daniel, we were chatting earlier about the sorts of people who come to these events in your faculty and the sort of events that you've got, who comes along, people designing tables from Japan, people doing all sorts of crazy things with wood, or doing something outrageous with virtual reality. So congratulations first to all the 22 people who arrived today as being the people most likely in your faculty to get a job. Because you're actually talking to people who are actually living and breathing it every day in terms of delivering this sort of service. So I think it's interesting to talk about how we do that and how do we set standards of ourselves in order to produce a level of quality in what we do as a profession. So although it sounds trivial, and I think in some ways maybe a turnout reflects that, there's a misunderstanding about where it takes us as a whole industry and what we deliver in the long run to our country in terms of how our cities work particularly. So in terms of, as an owner, what do we care about? A building quality guide, that's part of it, obviously, but it's fundamentally about the standards that you're sold. If you're, what sort of building is it? Does it meet your expectations? Does it allow you to understand what fair value is when you come to pay for it? Whether you're an owner or an investor coming to put your money in and buy a building, or whether you're a tenant who's going to come and use space in that building space. So from our point of view, it's fundamentally a fantastic and a very important thing that we have an agreed industry standard for those buildings. Improves our professionalism, even if it's voluntary. It sets that minimum baseline. And actually, the property industry is relatively simple. It works for buyers, and we need a simple tool with a lot of structure. It's actually just easy to collaborate and talk to people and make decisions. For investors, particularly, the guide actually also gives them quite a lot of information. So if you line a building up, you do a matrix, you line all the elements up, you actually have to fill them all out against the building itself. It allows someone to actually effectively work out, is this literally fair value? The money I'm about to pay, am I going to get it back? You can look at what your opportunities are for enhancing returns over the life of the time that you might own that building. It allows you to compare buildings on an apples to apples or apples to pears ratio. It's based on other standards and performance ratings, so I know that the data and the performance statistics coming into that guide are based on something quite real. It's information that allows modelling for cost-benefit analysis. It allows you to model market rents, like everyone's been talking about, and understanding performance and amenities. So in terms of how I would use it in my job, particularly looking at sustainable, responsible investment guidelines, we increasingly have massive superannuation funds from all over the world, but particularly Europe, coming to Australia, tipping truckloads of millions and millions of dollars into investment real estate in Australia. I want to quickly understand, what are the risks, what are my opportunities? How socially integrated is this building into its network and its location? What opportunities are there to improve indoor air quality and look at kind of standards over a long term? How do I realise long-term capital value by being clever about what I'm buying? And actually having a matrix with all that information laid against it does allow you to do that relatively quickly, in a way that in other markets you have to spend a lot of money in order to pull that information out. So for other people coming to Australia, it also allows us to absolutely capture some of those dollars that improves our cities and our built environment here. Flexible's good. We don't want it to be a mandatory tool. Thanks very much, Charlie. We don't want it to be completely blanket. It needs a bit of flexibility to allow a little bit of nuance, because buildings are not all the same. And sometimes you get a really spanking premium building that on one element might not have made it. And if you had to get all of those elements, it's crazy that it wouldn't make the grade. So I think allowing that little bit of flexibility and allowing it to be voluntary allows that to happen. The simple framework we talk about, is it an A plus or an A minus? Is it a B plus or a B minus? It feels like exam grades for buildings. But that's actually how we use it in our industry, talking about those things all the time. So in terms of how do we use it, what do we talk about? Thank goodness it doesn't have a star rating, is all I can say. I do not want any more star ratings. That would be really confusing. And no, it's not like the one on your fridge. So this is a very different sort of rating. It's just got a little more bones under it in that sense, and allows it to use it in a number of different ways, as you can hear. So it sets a standard and a minimum. It informs the buyer, whether they're the money or the people, bums on seats. It allows for nuance, and it's very simple and effective. We like it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good evening. Almost 30 years ago, I finished my first 2 weeks of work experience in the industry. So I thought, from a tenant's view, I've always been in the world of leasing for the landlords and leasing for the tenants. 50-50, first 15 years with the landlord, and then the second half of that career on the tenant side. So I just wanted to run it through how the tenants have viewed quality, because it has evolved, and you now know where we are. The first time I saw a matrix from, I thought it was the PCA, or BOMA as it was called, was actually a piece of paper about that size with a table on it that big that had location, floor plate, image, and that was it. So let's just go through a couple of the little eras that we've gone through. In the mid-80s, it was simple times. It was all quality meant location. So the Western Corridor was still city fringe. The banks were on Martin Place. The lawyers were near the legal courts, and the stockbrokers were near 20 Bond Street. So it was all about location. Also the railway stations. Then we went to the late 80s. It was the shiny times. Shiny buildings, shiny shoes, shiny people, everyone's happy. So it was all about the views, the status, and the floor plate size. Big was good. Then we went to the recession. It was tough times. Everyone had to stop and think about how business was done, how people were selling buildings, as in from the landlords to the tenants, and the tenants realised that maybe there was a way to answer back and negotiate a little bit more. So people started to question quality. It was actually the beginning of quality when people started to really, really look at the services of building and other things. Also at the same time, of course, the costs got pushed down, so the tenants won because the best buildings dropped by about 50% in value, and they got the best buildings for half the cost. So it didn't quite work for the landlords, but that's the way it panned out. In the mid-90s, it was workout times. That's when everybody was restructuring. It was all about cost constraint. It was all about value, new ways of doing business. The margins were down. It was tough times. But then there was no new buildings, so there was nothing to really compare. So everyone was still, the tenants were looking at buildings going, yeah, but that one's 10 years old, that one's 15 years old. But they were starting to analyse the buildings more so. And this was actually also in the mid-90s. That was the, we'll call it the rise of the tenant representative. Much to the bane of most landlords in those days, and some still today. There were the tenant representatives that broke out from the leasing agents and created a question to the landlords. How good and why are we paying so much money for your buildings? The late 1990s was the new buildings. That's, I heard, was in the 98, I think it was, Stephen, was the first of the official PCA guidelines. So the one I saw in 1984 really didn't change till 1998. But it was also because everyone started to question. So those buildings, the tenant said, if you want me to pay $700 a metre, you better give me a lot of service. And it was the first time you heard a leasing agent turn around to a tenant and say, but we've got more power, we've got better air conditioning, we've got better this, we've got everything else. It used to be, here's the building, do you like it? Have a nice day. So it was the turning point really where the PCA, as the landlord side, and the tenants really started saying, well, actually, we're all more educated, so we'd evolved from in the early 80s when people just said, yes, we'll take it because they didn't know any better. In the early 2000s, I call them weird times. We had the tech wreck, we had 9/11. There was no recession, but things seemed to stall. Again, there was no buildings, but the tenant reps kept progressing. Yes, I was one in 2000, broke away from leading the landlord team for a big company to actually starting up their tenant rep division. And it was actually with that years of experience beforehand easier to say to a landlord, no, your building is not A grade, it's actually B, because it was all subjective. So by that stage, the tenants knew what quality was. It had been drummed into them, they understood it, and the landlords actually had to compete for it, and that has sort of created a bit more balance in the market. By the mid-2000s, it was good times. It was really good times for a lot of people, lots of business, lots of competition. But quality then was really on the radar for this next batch of buildings that are coming up now, because they were being planned in those days. So I was asked as a tenant representative 10 years ago to look at plans of buildings saying, what do the tenants want? And pretty much it was the same thing. It was location, it was the views, it was the railway station. But at the same time, they said air conditioning, security, lifts, what are the services like? And we now, today, put all the buildings next to each other and look at a client and go, that's not A, that's not A, that's a B, that's a C. And it sort of allows everyone to actually put into a matrix, but a different way of looking at the matrix of what value is, because it's all about value. So quality really became value. Then, of course, we hit the recession in the late 2000s. Quality really mattered, but the prices went down a bit. Cost does too, and since then we've been all about cost. But by this stage, a lot of the older buildings had gone, so everyone has got used to better quality buildings. Now, with the newest buildings coming online, they're all premium, but they're premium because of the services. Today, we actually have more quality, more balance, more education, and the funniest thing is I was the only tenant representative on the committee for the matrix, and it was the landlords who were actually driving the quality. It wasn't me as the tenant representative, because everyone started to realise that if you want the quality in the services, you need to actually put something down so you can compare it and see where the true value is. So now, in parting, there was only 3 columns, half a page. Now there's 39 pages, whatever it is. Massive, massive matrix, and we've got full industry participation. So that's just a bit of background. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. What Stephen outlined is the fact that this is unique because it does include more than just the location and the size and things like that. The focus that I was involved with is related to environmental as well as engineering side of buildings. I'll just give you a few examples of the environmental, and whilst Beck says she doesn't like star ratings, we do, it's not a star rating of the building, but we do end up including some of the environmental ratings just so that it is comparison and it is the minimum requirement. So it's not necessarily that because it's a 6-star building, 6 green star building, that it's automatically a premium grade. We actually went a little bit further. Talking about green star, again, the previous version did not have what was the version of that green star. Now, as with many rating tools, there has been evolvement of that rating tool, so there's a version. So in this particular instance, it's version 3 that has been stipulated. So for example, for the premium grade, it's minimum of 5 green stars. For A grade is 4 stars, and so is for B grade building. Then we also included in that neighbors. Neighbors is what has been actually again a world first, and having seen other people talk about it, neighbors is a tool, I would say, which is available for saying what is the energy rating per square meter on sort of in a simplistic way for a building. Now, that is actual energy used for an existing building, or for a new building, you do a modeling exercise and you make a commitment to the neighbors' authorities and say that I'm going to commit to a 4-star or a 5-star or now even a 6-star. So again, from a neighbor's rating, the premium grade would be a 5-star, the A grade would be 4.5 stars, and the B grade would be a 4-star building. But by having those ratings, say for example green star, it's not necessary that the green star will include everything that we want. So within that requirement, we have actually stipulated further things such as the indoor air quality and the water side of things. Because you can get a Green Star building and not necessarily get such high ratings or such high scores for the indoor environment quality, for example. So they have been required to be 60% for premium grade, 50% and 40% of the maximum points available. So again, we went a little bit further by having more than just the star rating. For waste and for other things, we also had credits for the maximum credits that are allowed in those rating tools. With regards to engineering services, there are guidelines provided particularly for some of the newer technologies, such as for, say, chilled beams. Chilled beams is a type of air conditioning system where instead of what you see up here as air coming down, that's actually a cold surface, and it's by convection that you are air conditioning, say, this room. That technology is newer, so we have actually, in this guide, said what is the square meter that a beam, a chill beam or an outlet or that device, what area can it cover? Because if you've got a very large one, you will not be able to partition your offices as such. So again, in that one, there is a maximum zone size for perimeter and interior of, say, 75 square meters or 100 square meters for perimeter and interior. For a premium grade building, 85, 120 for an A grade, and 100 and 150 square meters for a B grade building. Similarly, there are capacities that, and other relevant parameters that have been nominated for building services, such as the allowances for power in a building, for allowances in terms of watts per square meter, which is higher for a premium grade building, etc., sort of thing. And for other services such as electrical and hydraulics and lifts for that matter, we've also got some parameters that the building has to comply with. So overall, from an engineering and from a sustainability point of view, it is a very, very comprehensive, and as was mentioned just now, that it allows for determination of saying that as a tenant or as a purchaser, are we paying for the right quality in that building? Thank you.
Thanks, Ashak. I'm a project manager and I spend a lot of my time working on existing buildings. In fact, I don't really work on new buildings at all. But most of my life is around taking existing buildings and upgrading them, assessing them and so forth to bring them up to standards. Since the PCA guide came in, it's actually assisted enormously when you're trying to set the standards for upgrading buildings. In the past, buildings would be upgraded, say maybe the engineering guys on site would think the air conditioning needs to be upgraded, but they wouldn't quite know by how much. But if they're air conditioning experts, they might push their clients, their building owners, to push air conditioning. And you tended to get unbalanced buildings, so they might overperform in some areas and underperform in others. One of the great things the PCA guide has done is actually simplify the process of strategizing, if that's a word, refurbishment of existing buildings. So you can actually set the building standard within the grade. It's quite interesting, for me anyway. I worked on 135 King Street, a building in the city. Many years ago, Macquarie Bank was looking at it and they said to the building owners, so how does it perform? What grade is it? And the building owners, like most building owners at that time, had no idea. So we took the dear old red book, mine's pretty worn out, as you can see, produced a spreadsheet based on the guide and actually went through line by line on the existing building tool and assessed the building against it to work out how the building performed. It's an incredibly good exercise for building owners to do. They actually learn how the building performs, and when they're dealing with tenants, incoming tenants, they can say, we know precisely how the building performs in different areas. And it was through that they could actually work out what they needed to do to achieve the standards set by the tenant. Also, there were areas, probably know Macquarie Bank, they're a very understanding, gentle sort of beast to deal with, and they had incredibly strong demand in some areas. But what this did was mean if they were asking for areas that were beyond grade A, that my client could say to them, fine, we can provide that if they could, but you should pay for that because what you're doing is offering to pay for a grade A building. You're now wanting services in some areas beyond grade A. You can pay for that. So it actually gave a lot of power to my client to through that process so they could actually control how the building was upgraded. So I often work for tenants and I've worked with Tom on buildings. When we're looking at buildings, we actually now do an assessment against the PCA grade. We might do it ourselves, or if it's provided to us by the developers or the owners, we can assess that. So it's become a very useful tool. The guide, I find, is also an incredibly green document in itself, not just the ratings that it has. So it does set environmental standards, but it also encourages developers to build buildings that are going to be wanted by the market. And often in the past, you'd see buildings that were built, and then when the tenants came in, they'd occupy them or they wouldn't occupy them. And it wasn't unusual with new buildings for owners to have to inject more money into the building just after it was built because it didn't perform well in some areas. Or an extreme example would be a building that sits there almost empty because nobody wants to use it. In my mind, that's the worst sort of environmental waste. You've wasted the embodied energy building a building, but you're not using it, or you have to change it and inject more resources into the building. So the area I work is what the Green Building Council calls the other 98%, so it's the buildings that are already built. So while it's nice to build new, for me I see it's critical, and the guide really helps here, is to encourage the reuse of existing buildings, because through this guide we can assess where the buildings sit now, we can work out what needs to be done to them. We can actually work out whether we can turn buildings into grade Bs or grade As or whatever the market might need, rather than destroying the embodied energy that is in existing buildings. So for me, from my point of view, the guide sets incredibly straightforward rules of performance. They're very clear, and it gives us a framework on performance that we can work with when we're setting standards for upgrading buildings. So that's all I have for now.
Thank you to the panel. Now, I did promise you a panel of experts, and so I'll just jump us to explanatory notes because I've been quietly jumping us through the guide as to the relevant components of each of what our presenters was talking about, and I hadn't got that far through. They are such a panel of experts that they even reminded me of one or two things that I'd forgotten. That the guide was simplistically about creating structure and language around some very complex areas. And in sharing the guide with you, you would have seen the way that we've come up with the criteria was not arbitrary at all. And now you can probably understand why it takes a committee about 18 months to, even once we've got the structure, to go through and get all the consultation and be considered in how it comes together. I also liked, Tom, your reminder of the 80s. I remember the 80s, yeah, shiny. More was better. That was the mantra. Not so much these days. No, these days, it's, as John says, it's about optimisation, repositioning. Sustainability is more than the light fittings. Certainly they're important, but it's that embodied energy and how we support where we work, live and play. That quality of life is the overarching issue. So, the panel, while we have them here, we may as well ask them some questions. Up for that? I think if I start off, I'll give them, you'll get the idea, and then we'll turn to the audience and see what you want to know. You get to grill the experts. So, I would say the owner, Beck, what do they really want? What is the owner looking for?
In the guide?
No, from the quality of their assets.
From the quality of their assets. They're absolutely looking for investment grade, as discussed. I think it absolutely has to meet the pool of money that's prepared to come along and look at it. So we talk about ourselves as an owner, logically, most of the big owners, who would be described as property owners in Australia, actually just look after other people's money. They own the buildings. So in this instance, for example, most of the buildings in our portfolio are actually owned by massive superannuation funds in Australia and overseas, big sovereign wealth funds from other countries like Norway or Abu Dhabi or wherever. So there's really a proper global market for investing in buildings. So we're really fundamentally looking for something that helps us set standards and have a platform for how we can really meet that market, explain what they're investing in a really clear, succinct, easy way, and make sure that the buildings that people like you are going to go and build for us or design are actually going to be able to be owned and purchased by people and be part of the economy. That's the first bit. The second bit is fundamentally what can we sell to the people who are going to come and live in this tenant space. How can we be really honest, or kept honest, I guess, to some extent, about what people that Tom works with want to see? And as John said, are we going to be kind of pegged back sometimes, of course, by having a guide like that? But I think really that's about professionalism in the industry and making sure that we're all able to play in a level playing field commercially is actually really important for where we go in the long run. So, yeah, it's absolutely about being able to meet the expectations of the customers and the expectations of investors.
Oh, that seems fairly straightforward. Lucky we have engineers like Ashak on the job, and you can deliver all of that, can't you, Ashak?
Absolutely, and not only that, but we go a bit further, that we ensure that the level of control in a building is also stipulated or is outlined. So say in one of the modern buildings now, if you have the latest technologies, it's not necessary that it's going to perform unless you have the right type of, say, control system to start with, and then the facilities management aspect to say that, yes, that is being done, so that it takes the full cycle, if you like, that not just a new building or even an existing building, but the way it operates, because that has become a critical part of it. Up to now, we have been, and that's not unusual in some ways, but from an environmental point of view, that we've been concentrating on energy, water, and all the resources, but equally important is the indoor environment. And right now, there is a lot of research going on in area of health, well-being, and productivity. And productivity always raises that famous question, is it productive if we do this or if we do that? For a simple answer, we would have got it by now. It's fairly complicated, but certainly there are areas that are being looked at. So with a guide like this and with the requirements of the clients, both from a tenant point of view and from the owner's point of view, I think the engineering and the technology has gone a long way.
So you're saying we'll just fill it up with chill beams?
Funny you should say that, actually. But there is analysis going...
More is better.
No, not necessarily. But what I'm saying is that chill beams, for example, the system that I was outlining, in fact, I'm doing a PhD with Professor Richard over here, and one of the questions that I haven't got the answer right now, so don't ask me, but one of the questions that we are looking at right now is which is more comfortable? The traditional variable air volume, the underfloor air conditioning, or chill beams? And in a year's time, you'll probably know exactly which one is, because it's going to take another year to find out the answer. But to answer the question about chill beams, that is the sort of thing that, again, property owners are realizing that that was a technology that drove a lot of the, if you like, was market-driven to achieve higher Green Star ratings. Because if you have a chill beam system, you will use less energy, and from a perspective of indoor environment, it's supposed to be really good and things like that, because you get fresh air, etc., sort of thing. So people were sold on that idea. The technology was slightly early in terms of the implementation, because the facility managers were not quite equipped with the knowledge. There was a knowledge gap between designers and facility managers. So what happened in the earlier cases was that a cold surface that you have in a ceiling space, if somebody's complaining that it's too warm and somebody just goes and turns it down completely, it's starting to condense. and you'll get raindrops inside an indoor environment, and unfortunately things like that have happened. So there was lack of knowledge in implementation. So to answer the question about chill beams, it's got to be taken as an overall thing rather than just saying that is the only technology.
Well, fortunately, that must mean all the tenants are delighted, Tom. They're all getting what they want.
Well, let me first say that what we do desire is A-grade buildings for C-grade rents. It doesn't quite work that way. And the landlords at the table will totally agree with me, that's what we like. But what we've worked out, and this is now in the last, in particular, 5 to 10 years, a tenant just wants a building that works, something that will meet its expectations, a good manager, and somebody that actually talks to them, which is a modern thing, just so everybody knows. And the reality is it's a building that works for their business for the next 3, 5, 7, maybe even 10 years. At that point, normally halfway through a lease, they're already starting to go, does this building work? Do we want to stay? Do we want to go? And the reason to go very often is not just economic, it is actually if the building works, the fit out works, the property manager is a great person, the rent is value, which is the operative word, the tenant will never move. And that's become the balance in the market. In particular, in the last many years, there's been more renewals that I've ever seen in my career because, well, A, there's not that much stock to go to. In general, there's still good vacancy, but a lot of the stock is not that good, and that needs to be upgraded. And with what John's saying, totally agree. I think the market is the refurbishment of smaller, older buildings so those smaller tenants can go and get the same quality of service for a lesser rent because it shouldn't cost as much as a premium building to refurbish a building and deliver a building that works for not just the small guys but also for the big guys.
So, John, doesn't sound like there's too much work in the repositioning of existing assets then, and I must say I've just flicked up here the building management, personnel, life cycling, energy, water. Why did we even bother putting them in there?
Huge change in the last few years in the quality of property managers. When you look at the systems they need these days, the systems they have to run, from very fancy BMS systems where they can control temperature and airflows in individual space, through to just watching the guys at companies like AMP, where they've got 3 or 4 different waste streams now they're managing. Investor has the same. They're quite extraordinary, the level of performance you need from the property managers. And also when you look at energy efficiency in buildings, the first thing that you need is management needs to be switched on first before the building. They need to know what they're doing. They need to be passionate about the way they manage the building, making sure things are turned off when they need to be, watching their BMSs to make sure there's no weird spike that happens that pushes up their energy consumption. Will also throw out their neighbours rating, because the neighbours rating needs 12 months of continuous good quality information to go into the rating, otherwise they'll lose their rating. And then we've got the funds and the advisors to the funds saying we need to see a portfolio with an average 4.5 or 4 neighbours rating. There's huge pressure on the property managers these days, and it's gone from being a guy with a bucket full of light bulbs to a technician behind a computer running these buildings, but then, as Tom says, talking to the tenants, being nice, knowing what the deal is, knowing the rent. It's quite an incredible change you see in and thanks to the PCA also, in the training. I think the PCA, everybody in the industry has been part of this change, but the guide calls for really switched on management. So it's interesting.
So we've heard from the owners, they want the financial returns and they want a commercial. The tenants, they just want more for less. But certainly user satisfaction is part of it. But that's okay, the engineers are going to save us. They're delivering on not just what we can do, but what we will do. And it's about that innovation. And yes, facilities management has come a long way. So Charlie, is the reason why the government's not here because we ran out of seats? Or, maybe the government, do you think the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding?
No, I think the government is here because we ran out of seats. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so that we can't get the funding. So, maybe the government is just sold on this stuff so much so
we couldn't spare a seat for them, or?
We'd certainly hope so.
Well, hopefully you're doing something about that.
I mean, part of this stuff is absolutely about getting on the front foot. I mean, we've got in Australia stringent minimum standards through the building code that enforce what the lowest common denominator should be. But as an industry, we've moved past that, and we're at the stage as an industry that we've reached a level of maturity where we're happy to say transparently, this is what our assets are valued at from a tenant's perspective. And I think by doing that, we've really pushed the needle forward, which has been to the benefit of the entire industry. Even if you look at specific examples, I mean, up there we've got stuff about communications risers. There's a conversation going on at the moment between the Department of Communications and the Building Codes Board about whether or not we need to regulate that, and we can go back and re-enter those conversations and say, look, we've got most of the building stock being built now is being built at a premium or A grade level, and within the definitions of those, we have criteria around what communications risers should look like. So it's the perfect example of self-regulation.
So do you see, why is it different in Australia? Why do we have a guide and nobody else has?
Well, I could boast and say it's because you've got the best industry lawyer.
Hey, Boehmer on steroids. It's the best explanation I could come up with. So, are there any questions from the floor? We have the experts. They seem to have all the answers for me, so let's see if you can trick them up. Yes.
In a domain of exponential technical improvement going on at a great rate, how do you avoid the outcome of falling behind whilst you're facilitating others to reach a standard which might, sooner than you realise, become obsolescent? How do you deal with that in terms of advising your clients? That's just a...
Good question. I'll simplify it. The world of IT as we know it has changed the way that the office space will work forever. You know, everyone's going ABWs and flexible workspace and everything else. The tenants are slowly moving towards that. So in the 90s, there was all this power. Everyone wanted more power, and that is why, because the density, you know, square metres per person was going down. Now, I don't know where that point is where the sustainability of everybody's going to go, well, we can't build that anymore because we're all down to one person per 6 metres, which is pretty tight. Doesn't happen too often. So I'm not sure where that cut-off mark is. Now, obsolescence, it might mean, and I don't know because when we see older buildings, but there are people who go, I like the older building. It's got a nicer feel to it. So it really, I don't know, it doesn't, there's no specific or generic way of looking at any building. The IT is going to be the biggest problem for buildings, and that's power. And of course, the problem with Australia, and I've done some work for all sorts of power users, big power users recently, there's not much power around, and it will be very interesting to see where that cut-off point is going to be where, because you have to, your phone, you've got to charge, your laptop, everything's got to be charged. The lighting can all be down. Everyone's worked that out, but I'm not sure where it's going to go. I think everyone's going to start working from home or at the beach, or actually go to 1 O'Connell Street. They've just opened up the Porter. In fact, I got a sneak preview last week, so I don't think it's open. Go to the back of 1 O'Connell Street, and they're calling it the Porter, and it's a new way. It's to service the buildings within 1 O'Connell Street, which still thinks it's prime, but it's not premium building by most standards. But it's this new way, and it's got all sorts of different settings. So what they're trying to encourage is to see where is office use going to go, and that will probably answer your question in about 3 years when they actually do all the analytics that will come out of it. There's no answers for even 5 years, is my view. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah.
Right. I would have thought the key word in answering your question would be flexibility. That is now, for my part, in terms of that's what the users of the future require, because we don't know what they're going to require precisely. So a lot of, in constructing this guide, we were looking for that, not future-proofing, but certainly trying to anticipate capacities.
flexibility is being countered by increasing compliance.
Yes.
So you've got a conflict there, which gets very difficult if you start thinking about flexibility.
If I may add, Google was the first, inverted commas, of the flexible workplace. In New York, they've just opened up their office, like now, and everyone has their own desk, their own work point, their own home, so to speak, and they've gone total 360. So who knows? It's actually up to the companies and up to the designers.
We're seeing that too with the move to activity-based working. There are so many downfalls with that too. A CEO friend of mine said it's fantastic because you can actually fire people and nobody knows they've gone. Because, but activity-based working is driving building the performance of the services down to incredible levels. People they'll look at increasing the desk density, which has an impact on the air conditioning system. So then they spend money on the air conditioning, which is fine, that's flexible. The power's reasonably flexible. You can bring in more power, but also the devices are using a lot less than they used to use. But you run into issues such as toilet capacity and lifts, and you can't increase the lift capacity in a building very easily. You can look at putting in double-decker lifts. You can have destination lifts to try and increase this, but you reach a point where you can't deal with it. I'm fascinated to hear what Tom's saying about Google, because I know a lot of people don't like it. You hear other comments where, I can see how much time my boss spends surfing the net when I'm doing all the work, those sort of things. So I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction with it too. We're also in this industry quite conservative. The property industry doesn't change terribly quickly. I suggest we'd still build traditional looking buildings for a long time yet, but still try and build in the flexibility that, which the dual beams can give us workstations that you can pick up and move. I can see a time when companies need to do a leasing deal where they can expand and contract, almost breathe in and breathe out every few years. So rather than losing a tenant, you actually have a deal, maybe you pay more than market rent, but that tenant can then have back some space 1 year or get more space another year. So it's those sort of things, I think, where you can see it changing.
And just as people change career now more frequently, buildings are being retasked and relifed more frequently. So what you start with is not what you're going to end up with in 10, 20 or 50 years' time. There is repurposing of the built environment, and that's part of what I think is the flexibility of it. Yes, Beck.
I'm just going to add to the obsolescence question. Obsolescence is a word that we're using quite a lot in the industry. It tends to be coming up a bit. Everyone's talking about resilience and obsolescence of buildings in the longer term, especially when it comes to things like climate change and climate risks in the space that I work in particular. Interesting looking at how can we make buildings more flexible, especially if you're building them new, but also existing buildings, to think about how they would need to transform over time in order to deal with those different situations and not be obsolescent in the future. And also looking at the general building stock across Sydney, for example, there's quite a lot of buildings turning over into more residential towers rather than staying as office buildings, because they just fundamentally cannot produce and perform in the way we need them to deliver those sort of spaces that tenants are looking for. So there is already a turnover of space in that sort of way. So those sort of changes are happening now as a result of what's already happened in the tenant market and in terms of what people are prepared to put up with or prepared to live with. And climate risk is an interesting one, a really small example. If you're looking at a building over a long time that has been there a long time, you've got a fairly tight plant room. You're about to up the density, because mostly that's what's happening across the industry at the moment. The density is getting more people load in the building, more heat load in the building. Your systems need to work harder, need to work smarter to be able to cope with that extra heat load. Fundamentally, you basically need to end up putting an extra chiller in, and then you add a heat wave or two, or a hot summer like we had last year, and you suddenly have a building that's not performing anymore. It's not meeting conditions, it's not meeting its grade quality, da-da-da-da. So it's interesting looking longer term about how we can transform existing buildings in a really smart way that would allow those sorts of transformations over time, especially when you look at longer term at how, and if you've got a long-term investor wanting to own a building over a long time, you've got opportunities to be clever about how you do that.
Very good. Sorry, I had one other Did I answer your question? Sorry, you're up.
I've got a question on the I guess the kind of reasoning behind distinguishing between existing and new buildings in the classification. I guess I haven't really studied the kind of characteristics for existing buildings maybe as much as I have for new, but am I right in saying that or is it the case that, say, a premium grade existing building is essentially the same kind of level of quality as a premium grade new building, or are there different levels of premium? My question goes to, question really means, say for instance, we've got, say, 126 Phillips Street or 8 Chifley or 1 Bly, generally premium buildings now. In 20 years' time, 30 years' time, when the market moves on, and or probably much sooner than that, eventually I can imagine the time when those buildings won't be classified as premium grade buildings anymore. So why make the distinction between existing and new? Or
So the distinction, because the existing buildings were existing buildings at the time the grade came
it
in.
seems like kind of this idea of apples to apples is like you're kind of saying, well, there's these apples and then there's another set of apples.
That had to be because when we brought the dear old red guide in, there hadn't been a robust grade system before then. So the buildings were built to whatever the developers thought was the appropriate quality at the time. What we did in the guide was actually set standards for premium. So some of those buildings may achieve those standards in certain areas, but there may be other areas where they just don't achieve. We brought in such things as services voids above the ceiling. So for premium buildings, I think it's 125 mil service void above the ceiling, uninterrupted space where the tenant can run their services. Well, some of the older premium buildings wouldn't have had that. It's not the sort of thing you can introduce. Others had more than that. Governor Phillip Tower's got about a 400 mil space where you can just raise the ceiling on any floor. So those buildings weren't built to the guide, so we needed to differentiate between the new buildings that could be built to the guide we brought in and the previous buildings that were deemed to achieve premium.
So will there always be an existing and new version?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, so taking it back to when we started the process back in 2005, John's right, the new and existing differentiation grew out of the consultations we went through. The idea that having the split had two major advantages. One, it wasn't unduly unfair to those, we're not grandfathering them in, because after all, PCA doesn't grade buildings. The market grades buildings. And the guide simply provides that framework, that language, that structure. So in terms of, in the first iteration in 2006, they were somewhat different. We were treating them like apples and oranges. Because, as I say, it would have been unduly unfair to the existing stock to put on them not just the current standards, but by splitting them into the new, the new created an opportunity for us to put in the stretch targets, to identify those characteristics, those features that weren't yet in commonplace, and indeed part of PCA's market leadership would be then to encourage the adoption and innovation. And those stretch targets were in that original guide. Now, as we move from 2006 to what we have now, the blue guide, one of the major tasks was the restructuring of the guide or the rationalisation of the structure, so that as you move through the guide, if you find yourself with B1, which is building size under configuration in new, it is also B1 in existing. That way, the two, what started as separate guides, are now aligned, so the criteria is consistent, as I said, the structure, the language is consistent, but there is a recognition that there is still a massive existing market. Will there always be two? Time will tell. But from the Property Council's point of view, politically, do you want to make a comment, Charlie? Or no, absolutely not. No politics in this at all.
I'll would expect there would always be a differentiation, just because you need to grandfather through the projects that have already commenced at the time.
But it's also important to understand how, and we've talked about the changing perceptions of quality. Quality is dynamic, and the guide, even though it appears static, of course that doesn't stop the market from reassessing buildings over time, which then throws you into, well, you do need to refurbish, you do need to keep up and reposition.
I wonder when Ashok was talking about Green Star version 3, if you can say, you know, that an existing building with premium grade version, whatever, so that it starts to differentiate that, because it seems a bit odd that a building could be kind of grandfathered in and given a premium status, and 20 years' time somehow still hold on to it.
But it can't. Firstly, when I said the grandfathering, that was just a point in time. We're talking about 2006. There was a, if you like, a respect given to the way things were currently. But we realised that the guide would be a massive change. So that was part of an accommodation. But remember, we're not grading, we're setting up a set of criteria. And as I said, over time, market perceptions change, but also buildings do fatigue, they do deteriorate, and their performance will wane. And so there is then, the guide actually is a great opportunity to keep the market fresh, up to date, and innovate even in existing. Isn't that right, John?
Existing buildings are upgraded to the new,
Exactly.
to the new PCA standards.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to say. So, your rating or your grade is only as good as the last time you checked it, your building against the grade, right? So it's a point in time assessment. So buildings are changing every day. They're mostly going downhill. They're getting used. They've got people coming in and out of them. The systems are working hard. Obviously they're just not going to stay that grade forever. It just doesn't happen. So we're obviously tipping money in all the time to reinvest, get them back up to speed, put new plant and equipment in. What do we need to do next to keep it at grade? So that's just the way buildings are managed now, and I think that would probably answer your question. But in terms of going forward, fundamentally, yes, new buildings should always have a new and stretching target, and that's about how we move the whole industry forward, especially when it's come to environmental rating systems or environmental ideas. That's allowed that to happen because it pushed it in a way that probably wouldn't have otherwise happened, and with industry support, it's allowed that to happen too.
When we were doing the guide too, we really did push the PCA. Ashok's mentioned the IEQ standard, so the 60% of the Green Star IEQ points must be achieved by a premium building. And I know we were both pretty vocal about this, that if you're renting a premium building, if being offered to the market, we think you should have the best air you can possibly breathe in a new premium building. So we really pushed that, and Peter Verwer, who was there from the PCA, really wrestled with that for a little while. But he
conceded in the end.
It was an open and frank discussion. Yeah.
But probably that's not the reason why it's in Singapore now, but that's a different reason. But just to answer your question, we're going to stipulate the V3, the version 3 of the Green Star, was that there is a big step change between the version 2 and the version 3. And that was partly the reason to say that we need to draw a line in the sand at that point in time to say, let's go again, pushing the boundary to say version 3 is what we are talking about.
And there's a great push for integrity in the document. Interesting, one of the things in my overview, I neglected to mention this page, which I think of as the 10 Commandments. These are the guiding principles that the committee set themselves. And there's issues here about higher, bigger, larger is not necessarily better. And this was us, not just to ourselves, but also to the market, trying to educate. This is an educational tool. Perceptions of quality change over time. But acknowledge that the guide should be reviewed at least every 3 years. So it is a dynamic thing.
If I may give you an example, there is a very well-known premium grade building in the city that services and the tenants, and the tenant reps in particular, because we hear it first, started to whinge so much, the tenants started to walk. Landlord said, I'm not doing anything about it. The rents went down, the tenants started walking. All of a sudden, the landlord went, but my building's a premium building, and everyone turned around and said, well, actually, it's not anymore. It's an A-grade building. Nice and shiny, but that was about it. So now they are tipping truckloads of money into that building because they need to raise back up to what an existing premium should be. So that's the process at work. Mind you, it takes 5 or 7 years, but so does property move slowly anyway.
Richard, do you have a question?
A technical question about this matrix. Has it got some recognition of relative weightings on these criteria? And if it has, how did you come up with these weightings?
We did wrestle with that, and we'll probably wrestle with it again when we reconvene the committee. But at the time that we decided not to have weightings, so everything appears equal in the guide, it is that recognition of the sophistication of the market, that if you make it too restrictive, too prescriptive, in telling, but it's like anything. If you squeeze too tightly, you miss things. So no, it is a level playing field. We have simply set out that structure and language, that framework. It can't be a one size fits all, and that's why it is a voluntary guide.
But within the ratings, obviously, there is different grades, like 5-star for the premium grade and 4 stars and things like that, plus this 60% requirement and 50% and 40% is a way of distinguishing between the grades.
But maybe as a building owner, you would have some sense, would you have some sense as to which of the criteria is going to have a much bigger influence on the rent? To put it crudely like that.
On the rent, absolutely. What can we get Tom and his team to play for? Quite right. And they're the basics. They're the things that you talked about before. Lifting is a really classic, a key one. Just the level of service and air is obviously always important. They're the kind of the basics about how the building works, actually, as you would expect to some extent. And then there's other amenities that you include. So what are the services or extra over that you're going to get for that extra money that you're effectively paying for the next grade up, if you like, and then sort of start to come into it. But it is fundamentally just the basics of how the buildings run.
Interesting, within this descriptor, which is actually a legacy element from the original work that was done back in the 1990s, philosophically, these bullet points here are intended to try and capture those perceptional issues.
And there was an understanding that you didn't have to actually, to be premium or A or B, you didn't have to meet exactly every single one. There was a beautiful word thrown in somewhere along the way that says overwhelmingly meets that. So as a tenant rep, I'm a cynic, as you can probably tell. And
I'm the optimist.
Absolutely. So it's really then an interpretation of overwhelmingly being, meeting the criteria of the tenants, but also of the landlord. And that's when I said before, when a building works, you know where that point is, and that should be the market rent at the time for that building.
John would probably have a very good sense of, if you only had a limited budget to try and refurbish a property to lift it up, you would target some of those criteria first.
Absolutely, yeah, you would. They're very much hurdles as well. So we've sort of set hurdles that they need to achieve, but then you leave the weighting really to the market, to the owners, to what the tenants demand. But yes, it'll be good air conditioning, as Beck says, good lifts, those sort of things, sufficient power supply. But there's also, within the guide, when you talk power supply, we're actually trying to reduce the amount of power a premium building is bound to provide, to give them the opportunity to provide less and encourage better performance, because the more power you supply, the more power tenants will use. And the opportunities these days to actually use less. So we had long discussions about that too, about trying to push down the standard. I think we were pushing, the industry actually wanted, was sort of half was with us, probably half against. Some of them were quite keen to provide the opportunity to provide less. So if a tenant needed more, well, they can put in more themselves, but the landlord doesn't have to provide it.
And that's part of the overwhelming principle here, the idea that not everything is going to be important to everyone. And indeed, if you take we've been talking about the guide in somewhat a reactive form of assessing the delivered product. You can actually quite easily take the guide, and I've done it many times, you turn it around, it becomes a briefing tool. And that way you can create a developer's or a tenant's own weighting system very quickly, because they can prioritise by paired comparison across even at that superficial level of the 14. But then you drill down into the 60 odd items and you fundamentally have your brief.
what's important to you as
Yes.
a tenant. That's the process.
And that's the
I've started
sophistication of the
getting work
market.
together.
People know what they want, and indeed those wants and needs are changing at an increasing pace. So that flexibility of the guide is actually inbuilt there.
Increasingly, though, it is air conditioning, air quality, control of air, so good quality BMS systems. Huge amount of money
See.
has probably been spent with Schneider and people like that, putting in, incredible systems. And they seem to get outdated.
You see, what Charlie wants to say is that if this was easy, everybody else in the world would do it too. It took the property council's innovation and leadership to deliver something which is so useful and so valuable to the market, to fundamentally all our stakeholders.
It's part of everyday conversation in the industry too. It's bizarre how people just say, where does that fit in grade A? And, we're upgrading the air conditioning. Well, what are we going to provide? What's the density? It's amazing.
No self-respecting person in the property industry has not read it. We've all read it cover to cover. It's one of the first things you do when you start a job in a property company. Read the guide. Get your head around it, you need to know it. It's very simple.
Were there any other questions?
Yes.
Wouldn't
mind.
No, go for it.
Experts here, I might as well get in.
Yes.
I recently spent a bit of time looking at Parramatta Square, and I had a look at the Heron Building in London, and I realised that the net lettable area was 73%. I came back and chatted with an acquaintance who works for Lend Lease, and he said, 27 core, that's ridiculous. We wouldn't participate in that sort of outcome at all. So what I'm thinking from a designer's point of view, that would it be possible to influence design competitions by having an additional criteria which put an evaluation on the gross to net lettable area and how it might affect the envelope? Because we've been struck by having to have a narrative which does bizarre things to buildings, if you know what I mean. And
now I wish I'd invited an architect.
I think you appreciate what I'm talking about.
Check. Yeah. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah.
Check out the DGW work done in the late 90s on buildings. I was actually captain of the leasing, one of the best leasing teams in Sydney at the time, and all the new buildings that we were trying to lease to the tenants, we had DGW run through and rate the buildings in all sorts of various things. Funnily enough, in the last 5 to 7 years, I haven't seen any DGW work, but it was so revolutionary and it was so simple, and it gave you the efficiencies of buildings, the GLA to NLA and everything else. It was just, and they did rate it, and you used to actually, as a tenant rep, whilst that DGW work was still around, you'd actually get buildings rated not just on the matrix, but also on efficiency, right. And then you factor in your numbers and you tell the landlord it's 80%, not actually 85%, and you sort of would never manipulate numbers. and then you would actually, and the efficiency was a major factor. I remember in the US there was a building that had 33% load factor. So you're only paying for, you only get 67% of the space that you actually can use.
Thank you.
Yes.
Beck, you mentioned before about truckloads of money coming from overseas. Is this document part of the reason that people from the Netherlands feel comfortable in pouring money into Australian buildings? Because you can read this document and get a very good idea of what it is you're buying, as opposed to going to the States and thinking, for the three-sided coin, you may or may not be right.
It certainly gives them more comfort from a long way away in the sense of what sort of industry are we, what sort of business do we do, how do we think about ourselves and rate and assess ourselves as an range of organisations. Absolutely, of course. They've just got way more information almost at their fingertips in a way that they have to effectively pay someone to provide them for in the same sort of way in other markets. So yes, So they would still look for all that information in order to make an investment decision. It doesn't stop them doing that, but they may well have to pay for that information to come to them.
We sell dozens of copies of the guide to every quarter of the place. So there's copies being shipped to the US, to the UK, to the Netherlands. It's certainly an international standard for Australian investment.
I think we're about done on time, aren't we, Richard?
We are.
They're going to throw us out of the room.
Perfect.
So, sorry about that one. But thank you to all the panel for putting yourselves out and for sharing your knowledge.